Hello, welcome to the first video of conflict resolution contentment in the classroom. For this video, I'd like to accomplish three things. First of all, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about myself, and then talk about what can conflict do, and then also the cost of conflict, especially the cost of conflict in the workplace. So I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. This picture you'll see next is one of my favorite pictures. Yes, this is my family. This is my wife, Jen. She's a wonderful person. She's a nurse at a cardiac floor. I do speeches around the country to teach continuous education for doctors and nurses, and she gives me great insight on what happens at a hospital. This is my oldest daughter, Savannah, and she is bright, going into the first grade. And this is my youngest daughter, Adeline. Just an incredible person with an incredible smile. One of the reasons why I show this picture is you'll hear stories that I'll tell about these three. And it's just a great idea for then you can put some of the stories, some faces to some of the stories you're going to be hearing about in a little bit. So how I got into conflict resolution. Years ago, I started peer mediation programs in the United States, but I also started them in third world countries. This is a program that I started in South Africa, in Cape Town. Cape Town's a place I used to live, and I've done a lot of traveling in. This was a month-long project. This school in particular was a very poor school. It was built for 1,500 kids, and they had almost 3,000 kids that attended this school. But these students were just absolutely phenomenal, being able to speak 3 and 4 languages. Thankfully, they spoke English, so I was able to teach them peer mediation. I've also done peer mediation in the United States. I developed and trained students. This is also another school that I worked at in my month-long project in South Africa. This was a little bit of a richer school and brand new school, but the difficulties that these students had was there was a mix of 3 or 4 different schools that they brought into one. So it was quite difficult. And I do like to travel. This is a project that I worked at in Bolivia. We brought in about $500,000 worth of medication into Bolivia. I am not in the medical field, but I wanted to go onto this project because it had a lot to do with working with students and adults, and I could teach conflict resolution in bits and pieces. But the main mission of this was a medical mission that was for Project Helping Hands. So how I got into conflict resolution is I did a lot of peer mediation and a lot of volunteer work in peer mediation. And I've been a manager most of my life. And I noticed that during management is anytime that somebody had a conflict, there wasn't a lot of avenues to go to in order to bring up conflict in the workplace. Now, I know what you're saying. There's a lot of HR programs, and I'll tell you, HR programs are great programs. But usually when a conflict goes to HR, it's escalated, and usually people end up getting fired or they ended up getting written up. What I wanted to do with my company is go in and train employees, managers, conflict resolution skills, so when a conflict arises or an argument arises between employees, we could get it right at the very beginning, and instead of letting it escalate. I like to give them tools of the trade in order to teach them how to deal with conflict right when it happens, instead of it getting to the point where it gets to HR and people end up getting fired. So I started a company called Resolutions for Work, where I do teaching at local community colleges, also at universities, at school districts, or at hospitals. So, that's enough about me. And throughout the 9 weeks, you'll hear me hear stories about me talking about different things that have happened to me. But let's look at what conflict can do. So first of all, conflict has energy. And I believe conflict has some sort of energy that can affect people in different ways. And if you don't believe conflict has some sort of energy, the next time you see somebody having an argument and you're around them, notice the negativity that you can almost feel when those two people have conflict. That's the kind of type of energy I'm talking about. When people are in an argument or in a fight, you can see the hatred or the emotions that are going through two individuals. So this is the energy I'm talking about. How can conflict have a toll on our bodies? So one of the reasons why it can take a toll on our bodies, conflict can, is because of the psychology term, the fight or flight complex. And this is where a conflict comes up or an argument comes up, and the body handles this two different ways. The first one is they're going to get up and fight. They're going to attack the conflict. And sometimes when somebody attacks the conflict, you yourself are going to get hurt and the other person's going to get hurt. Or the other idea is the flight complex. And the flight complex is you're going to run away. And this is typically how most people deal with conflict. They retract from it, or they hide from the problem. Now later on, I'll talk about an idea that I have where you're attacking it, the argument or the conflict, but you're doing it in a healthier manner. But we'll get that on to later on. I just want to kind of look at what happens to individuals when they are in conflict. So a couple things can happen, and this is mental stressors. A lot of people that deal with conflict have problems with their memories or their inability to concentrate. They have poor judgment, racing thoughts, their moodiness. It's because it takes a toll on the brain because you're constantly thinking about the conflict that you have had with this person. Some people feel isolated. They're constantly worrying. They're viewing everything as a negative. Their restlessness. They're quick-tempered. Sense of being overwhelmed. Generally unhappy, loss of objectivity. And sometimes they feel fearful. Some of the physical stressors that conflict can happen is people have headaches, muscle tension, nausea. Have you ever had a conflict with somebody and that you thought about it so much that your stomach starts to hurt? I think we've all been in that situation. Acne breakouts. This is especially big with students in grade school or high school. They're dealing with a lot of stress with conflicts in their lives. Have breakouts. Feeling sick, weight gain or loss of appetite. Sleeping too much, nail biting, pacing, starting fights, tooth grinding. These are all physical things that can happen when you have conflict. The other thing that can happen is post-traumatic stress disorder. And this happens when somebody has a conflict with another individual and they don't deal with it. Later on, we'll talk about how to deal with conflict in a positive, non-negative way. But post-traumatic stress disorder can happen with conflict. So let's look at the cost of conflict in the workplace with emotional stress and financial stress. Financial cost. So when you're at work, there's emotional stress that can happen. At work, people can have poor morale. People are more absent. when they have conflict. When there's conflict between coworkers, wasted or non-productive time can happen. Poor decision making. Now, this is something that's really big in hospitals, because if you have a nurse and a doctor that are having conflict between each other, and that nurse makes a poor decision or the doctor makes a poor decision, you're talking about stuff that's life-threatening. Okay. Also, employees can become resistant to other employees or feuding groups. The we versus they attitude. We all know that in the workplace, there are groups that are formed, and sometimes those groups that get formed don't like each other. And so they cause conflict between each other, and it becomes almost that us and them kind of camaraderie at work. Poor communication. This is especially problematic when managers fight with their employees. They have poor communication between each other. People get unfair treatment, discrimination, harassment, stress-related mental conditions. People get sick more often at work when they have more conflict. Workers' compensation claims are higher. Complaints and grievance. Theft, sabotage, violence, and lawsuits. If we don't deal with conflict at work, there's a lot more violence at work. People sue each other more at work. And then also, theft happens. If an employer thinks that their employer isn't doing stuff correctly and they're being treated unfairly, sometimes they take things from their workplace. It could be pens, papers, videos. They can take valuable stuff at work and bring it home with them because they feel like they're being untreated. Also, sabotage. I heard a story that an employer was upset with his manager because he felt like he was being unfair to him, and ended up putting a virus in the computer that cost over $100,000 to fix. So all of these things can become problematic at work. Financial cost. So a study done by the American Manager Association on the cost of conflict showed that managers will spend between 20 to 30 to almost 50% of his or her time dealing with conflict at work. So in other words, during an average work week of 40 hours, managers are spending anywhere between 10 to 25 hours a week just dealing with conflict. That's a pretty high number. Absentees is a conflict-related cost that can be measured by using a simple formula provided by the U.S. Department of Labor. Experts suggest that your absentees goal should be 3% or lower, rather than the current average of 6% per alum. What this is talking about is the average number should be 3% of absentees during an average work week. But because of conflict, we are starting to see numbers up to 6%, people taking more time off in order to not deal with conflict. Statements like, well, I'll just take the day off because I don't want to deal with this coworker or that manager. So they use their time off more because of the fact that they're not wanting to deal with conflict at work. This last number is the Gallup organization calculates the cost of loss of one employee at 6 times that person's annual salary. So we all know that people, if they don't get along with their manager or they don't get along with a coworker, can leave their job because of it, if that problem is not dealt with. So that is the average employee salary is 6 times that of having somebody come in and train somebody to replace them. So let's look at just costs of numbers. So a business, one manager, let's just say that they make $50,000 a year. 30% of that time throughout the year is used to deal with conflict. That's over $16,000 being used to deal with employees and conflict on a daily basis. Now, if we look at 10 employees at $35,000 a year, 6% of that, which is they're taking more leave of absence, is $21,000. That's a pretty big, huge number, especially in a business. Now, if one employee leaves that's making $65,000 a year, $210,000 it costs to replace them. So if we average all these numbers up, it's $247,000 it can cost the company, and all we're talking about is 11 employees. Now let's times that by a company like Nike that's got several thousand employees. These numbers can just go up huge. How many people at your work do you have? Managers, principals that are dealing with conflict. So the cost of conflict is quite large. So this is just a short video just to kind of get your mind starting to think. So your journal entry for the week is, give me an example of a conflict at work and how you resolved it. Maybe you didn't resolve it. Tell me why you didn't resolve it then. But I want an example of a conflict, 1 to 2 pages that you'll need to email me about thoughts of what happened on the conflict and maybe how you could have resolved it. We'll use this conflict throughout the 9 weeks to kind of build on it for maybe you can deal with it in a more positive way. Thank you, and I will see you next week. Oh, you'll see another video next week.